Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the M&E Drop-In. I'm your host, Moj, and today I'm joined by Joseph Lloyd. He's the CEO of Paddeco, and he's here to talk about the current legislation that we're facing in the construction industry, and in particular, how this is going to affect M&E contractors. So, Joe, how are you? First of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Tell us a bit about yourself and your background, please.
I suspect from an engineering and construction sort of viewpoint, you don't want me to go back to the 60s, do you? My engineering and construction sort of experience starts in the late 70s. I was a petrochemical apprentice. I used to work for Shell as a young man. I sort of was more then in the HVAC industry in the mid-80s. I've got experience in manufacturing. I've got experience in the construction industry and the nuclear industry. So I've got quite a broad range of engineering and construction. Sort of moved into the educational side, late 90s, turn of the century. And at the minute, say I'm the CEO of Paddeco, which is an organisation, in effect, it makes judgments on people's competence and compliance. Which is probably the topic that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, this is something that is quite needed at the moment. With so much legislation, it can be quite confusing to navigate, I imagine, and a bit overwhelming and daunting considering just, the Building Safety Act, the Hackett Report, the Golden Thread, the new PAS documents. There's just a lot. And so it would be, considering your experience, it would be good to get your perspective on what exactly competence means.
I mean, it's a great question because we constantly see competence, right throughout social media, on legislation. Competent people need to be competent, and I suspect if you look at the dictionary, competence will say one thing. I'm a simple person. I actually try to break things down that maybe people will sort of grasp it. I look at competence as the ability to do a task. Whereas compliance is about conforming to laws and standards. I've probably got the engineering competency to rewire your house, replace your boiler. But I suspect from a legislative point of view, I'd probably be struggling. And another example, analogy I give people is you might pick me up from the train station, drop me off at the hotel, and you can drive that vehicle very competently on the road. If you don't have a driving license, you're not legally compliant. So competence, performing a task, the system might go into a specification or a component. Compliance is actually holding the license that legislation say you should have. The driving analogy is quite good because many years ago, late 70s, early 80s, we used to drive vans and cars. 1983, overnight, we all jumped into our cars and vans and many of us broke the law. Why? Because the legislation changed. And all of a sudden, it was a legal requirement to wear a seatbelt. So that's what we're faced with as an industry now, is a lot of legislation has sort of changed over the last sort of, certainly over the last 5 years, certainly from Grenfell. Regulations and legislation is bearing down now. And the industry's sort of just looking at, where is competence? What is it? I always say to people, start from the law, that leads to the standards, and make sure we basically meet legislation. So competence, yes, I can perform the task. What's the license to perform that task? And that's what people have been looking for.
On that point about the legislation changing, I think this is why we try to, as Midfix, we try to emphasize, and that's kind of what we talk about a lot on our social media and, on the podcast now, is because I feel a lot of people just aren't aware of the changes. We've always done it this way. Why is it wrong now? But that's kind of why we...
I think if you're going to look at, what legislation will have an affects industry, a lot of construction will be familiar with regulations, manual handling, COSH, Pure, Lola. They're regulations that they're familiar with the name. You might not be able to tell you exactly what they mean. And the way to sort of look at regulations are what we call statutory instruments. They're owned by the HSE. They're basically classed as secondary legislation. The difference with the Building Safety Act, it's what we call primary legislation. It's an act of law. When it comes to actually competence, the wording's been there in a lot of other regulations, and people will say to you, people have got to have the skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours. It was actually in the CDM. It was basically called skills, knowledge, experience and training then. So we've always had these, if you like, things we should be doing.
Yeah.
They just weren't enforced. But the Building Safety Act is different. It's an act of law, and there's things in it. I mean, it's not great bedtime reading. You know? Probably is for the lawyers. But there is things in there, and they are you will do and you must do. And that's going to basically give a lot of challenges, certainly to industry, certainly to the principal contractors and companies who are, in essence, they are the caretakers of the construction sites. So there's a lot of legislation pushing down, and people are trying to decipher that, what course and what qualifications they should go for.
Yeah, I think because it's, like you said, it's not really a bedtime read. These legal documents are usually just filled with jargon and can be quite confusing for like the average person to understand what to extract from them. So how would you, put simply, define what the Building Safety Act defines as competence, as in the requirements?
That's a great question. I think there's a few items I'd certainly encourage people to look at within the Building Safety Act. Item 35 and 33 and the 148. So item 35, we talk about competence. They define it there. And it's basically individual must have the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours.
But that seems subjective, doesn't it?
It does for some. So the experience, we can probably all make a judgment on.
Yeah.
The behaviours is an interesting one because obviously there's other, if you like, standards that now have come up, certainly the BSI 8670, which is all about competence behaviour. What people will be looking for is where is the skills and knowledge for my occupation. So if by law I must have the skills and knowledge under item 35 of the Building Safety Act, where is the skills and knowledge for an installer? Now the skills and knowledge are written and defined by sector skills councils, standard setting bodies. Who are they? They're normally either appointed or licensed by the government, and what they do is they basically make national occupational standards. What happens then is normally an awarding body, qualifications, they will make the qualifications based on the national occupational standards.
Okay.
So you'll start to see the national occupational standards play a more upfront role. You'll start to see that I've never heard of national occupational standards. Now, where are they? Certainly going up, they're on a government website. Important bit is they contain defined skills and knowledge. So if I've got to, by law, have the skills and knowledge for an installer, you go and achieve that. Some awarding bodies use the NOS directly, and some awarding bodies will do a reflection, but that is the key to linking the skills and knowledge.
So forgive my ignorance, but are there national occupational standards for every single, or like every kind of main occupation within the construction? So is there like a supervisor one, an installer one, or?
Great question. Yeah, there's virtually national occupational standards for everything we do in society as good as. So don't just think engineering construction. There's a national occupational standards for making a cocktail. There's national occupational standards, for cutting hair. Yeah, that's the great thing when you look at national occupational standards. So yes, there is national occupational standards for most of the occupations, certainly in construction, engineering, and they are, they're defined. So there is a national occupational standard for overseeing operatives and contractors in building services engineering, and defined BSE 03. They are there.
Okay, you just have to look for them.
Well, you've got to be familiar with them. A lot of our industry, it's brilliant at designing, building, constructing, installing. There's not as much knowledge of authority and who makes decisions. Where do qualifications come from? Why do they matter? So they are there, and they'll have to be more familiar as we go along. But yes, there is national occupational standards for health and safety. A good example, certainly in some of the presentations we do, if you picture a normal construction site and let's say it's a high-rise building, and on the left-hand side, you've got trades putting floors, walls in, ceilings. On the right-hand side, you've got, if you like, people installing fire-resistant ductwork systems, pipe work. They've actually got two different health and safety standards. So the health and safety standard for construction is done by the Sector Skills Council, and the health and safety standards for, if you like, mechanical and electrical is different. And that's the sort of level now we're going to have to be looking at, because people have got to judge whether someone's competent in that health and safety standard. And they're different from the occupational standards. So you'll have an occupational standard for installing a wall, which will be different from the health and safety standard. And normally they're all encompassed in a qualification.
So what you're saying is you kind of have to look at both and make sure you're complying with both. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, you'll see a lot of drive to, certainly with short courses on the engineering, if you like, occupational side. But you can't ignore that someone needs to be safe practices before they even step foot on site, and they do exist. So the health and safety standards do exist. We've got to make sure we keep an eye on them, and the occupational. There's other national occupational standards within there. There's a national occupational standards for working relationships. That brings a lot of, if you like, how we receive technical and functional information. So if you're using data and functional information drawn in specifications, there's a standard for that. So the standards are out there. Certainly one for cocktail.
So you mentioned the British standards for competence behavior.
Yeah.
Was it that?
Yeah, the BSI 8670.
Yes, sorry. And speaking of British standards, I feel like a lot of people assume that when they are doing what the British standard says, then they're being compliant or whatnot. What is the difference between the British standards and the national occupational standards?
I think certainly the new suite of standards, if you like, for the industry, for the competence and compliance that we're going to need. There's like the 8670, which is more about competence behaviour. There's a bit of fire in there. The 8671, which is a lot of competence requirements for designers. The BSI 8672, which is the principal contractors. I don't envy their job. And then the management, the 8673. The way I look at the British standards, they're a guide, if you like, of how things should probably be done. The difference with the national occupational standards is judgments can be made on a person's competence. So ultimately, the occupational standards and the performance and knowledge is you must be able to do and you must know. Just because we might read a DVLA book on how to drive a car, we can't really make a judgment on that individual. Whereas the national occupational standards and, if you like, apprenticeship standards, they are there to be made judgments against people. And that's why they're important. So doesn't mean the British standards aren't important, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, but that's kind of my... Why do you think it is then that more people talk about British standards?
Because it's familiar to them. I mean, I suspect if you 4 or 5 years ago talked about national occupational standards, people wouldn't even know what you were talking about, didn't even know they existed. But now we're talking about individual competence, certainly from a legislation point of view. Now they'll start to push forward and people will start saying, well, MVQ level 2 or level 3. Okay, well, where does that come from? And basically qualifications come from standards. But standards for me are important. Why? Because the law says you need to have the skills and knowledge. So let's look at the skills and knowledge for that occupation and let's achieve those skills and knowledge that's in those standards.
Okay, so then speaking of the PAS documents,
yes,
tell us about those, please, and how will they impact the industry? What do they kind of stipulate?
There's lots of PAS documents, and lots of BSI standards. I think for our sector, if we look at obviously what's happened, certainly that suite. The BSI 8670 is now going to push down on people's behaviour. We've got units and standards of working relationships. They're within qualifications. But I think there will be a lot more now focus on, if you like, the ethics, people having, if you like, moral compass. It'll be interesting how we're going to actually upskill people with that and then measure it. But they are there, the criteria is there. The 8671 is a real challenge, I think, for industry because it's specific to designers. So they really face a bit of a challenge. I'm not a designer. But the biggest one for me is the 8672. When you read the 8672, which is basically a standard for the principal contractor, it's telling the principal contractor they are now basically in charge and they are responsible for the competence of the workforce. That's a huge challenge. That is a huge challenge for them. If you've got 500 people on a site and they are now charged with looking for the gaps within their working role, it's huge. And that's, to be honest, we've stepped forward with quite a few of the principal contractors and reached out to them because they won't be familiar with these standards that we just said. Supervisors are a great example. The responsibility on a supervisor now is huge. They're not just responsible for the logistics of the job, the welfare and the safety of the people below them, and the client's demands, the organisational procedures, just the job going into specification. They're now responsible for looking at the needs of competence to the people below them. How is a supervisor going to be familiar with a National Occupational Standard, which is the Learning Development Standard 2, is where you identify the development of an individual. That's a challenge. So there's a lot that's sort of going to push down on the principal contractor, and they're going to need a lot of support. And I do feel for them.
So, okay, so we're talking about a lot of things here. So there's the BSA competence requirements that we have to worry about. There's the NOS standards.
Yeah.
There's the BSI PAS documents. And obviously, as an M&E contractor, from their perspective, they're trying to balance all of this while also keeping their business afloat and, going about their day-to-day life. So what if from someone who wants to be compliant, what's the first step, do you think? Like basically, what do you do?
It's a great question, and there'll be many organisations out there who will be in a sort of thing. The way I try to put this over in the presentations is, if you've got a company and you send the workforce out on a job, you would not send that workforce out without a driving licence.
Yeah.
Why? Because they understand, well, they need that. They're familiar with that law. What they need to start looking to is, where's the licence for my people to install that system? Because law is now saying you need skills, knowledge, experience. Okay, well, where is the licence? Do they exist? They do exist. So a lot of people will have experience. I've been doing the job for 20 years, for the same company. They'll have a great reputation. They're probably working with, maybe a tier 1 or tier 2 contractor.
Yeah.
So they've got a track record of systems in place. It's sort of, I use an analogy of, imagine myself and you are about to do an audit on a taxi rank or a delivery organisation. And we walk in and we do an audit. We check the policies, procedures, all the processes. We check, if you like, the vehicles themselves, and everything seems to be great. There's dates, there's times, there's locations and signatures. But then in the audit, we see that no one's got a driving licence. Okay. And that's the sort of way of companies will be operating with incompetence to, if you like, their clients, but they won't actually be familiar with the law now that's coming up to say you need a licence in what you do. And where is that licence? Who decides what that licence is? Bring it back. Skills, knowledge, by law, I must have for my job. The skills and knowledge then will lead you to the National Occupational Standards. And then it's the reflection of, how do I achieve those National Occupational Standards? Sometimes they're embedded within qualifications. Sometimes you can have them as standalone units. Okay. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. The industry faces some real challenges with competence and compliance. But the law's set, and the law was, royal assent was given last April, and it's having a huge impact. There'll be a lot of people out there who are very competent at what they do, but if me and you went and carried out an audit and we looked for the licenses on the installation, the truth is they might be very experienced, probably got great behaviours, but they can't prove it. And just because someone has a coloured card doesn't mean you've got a licence. Just because I'm a member of the AA doesn't mean that I don't have to have a driving licence. So search for the licence in the occupational that you do.
Okay, so we're talking about how they need a license. How does one go about getting a license and achieving this NOS? And I imagine it varies greatly from occupation to occupation.
Yes, of course. Obviously, there's different occupational standards for different, if you like, trades. You're now in the world of learning and development standards. And again, it's a great question of who judges and who makes the judgment that you are competent. Exactly. Once again, I'll take you back to your driving test. Is someone made a judgment that you can perform and move that vehicle? And this is, if you like, now the world of training providers, awarding bodies.
But okay, so then the training providers themselves, who do they provide the licenses to the ones below, and then do they also need a license? And then who's at the top of the hierarchy?
Yeah, I mean, you're not about quality control now. So you're right. Yeah, competence of an individual, someone has to make a judgment. Like I said before, driving a car, someone made a judgment that you could. Normally that person would have been qualified to make that judgment, and there's a centre. Similar with, if you like, training providers. And training providers normally then will make judgments within qualifications that they're actually making judgments on. Okay. The awarding body will monitor that and make sure that the training provider is actually doing what it says on the tin. So there's three layers really. The qualified assessor will judge the occupation, make a judgment. Then there's an internal verifier who will actually make a judgment on that process.
Okay.
And then there's an external verifier, we call them, who will make a judgment on that. So there's a lot of filters from a quality point of view. And linking that to the golden thread, you want that traceability. You know, the golden thread for me is about accountability and traceability. And there's a lot of systems being installed in industry and signatures are being put down. And while they might have gone into a specification, it doesn't mean that the person was legally compliant when they put it in. Judgments, when you make judgments against systems and you make judgments against people, they're different standards. Analogy I use is when you put your car in for an MOT, someone will make a judgment on that component, it meets the specification. But that information doesn't tell you about the individual's ability to drive the car.
Yeah, exactly.
The different standards. So,
but both are equally important.
yeah, both. Yeah, I mean, when we carry out certainly a lot of supervisors and handover of systems, we need to make sure the system's gone into specification. It's commissioned right. But when it comes to competence of individuals, and certainly under building regulations, it doesn't say, if you like, that job's gone into the competence is the person.
Yes.
So the regulations are more about, and the law is about, has the person got the skills, knowledge, experience? We can make judgments when people do put systems in, that it's gone into specification, and we can use that evidence, certainly in apprenticeships, that they've actually installed it. But when it comes to actually making judgments on people and systems, they're different standards. And that's going to be challenging for people.
Okay. So taking all of that into account now, what are the main challenges, would you say, that the industry is facing right now?
Huge.
Yeah.
Collaboration will be key. We've seen this legislation have an impact on the industry before. I think it was 1999 when the management regs landed, and they had a real impact on the working place. In particular, risk assessments was in the 1999 regs and preventive measures. And what it did is the principal contractors grabbed those regulations, and they actually then implemented changes within the workplace. All of a sudden, we start to see secured construction sites, hoardings going up, signs, walkways, turnstiles. We see the introduction of site inductions really start to play a part now. We can see the introduction of risk assessments, which is mainly what it was driving, method statements, the use of permits. And we even, actually at that point, involved the workforce into hazard identification. So that legislation came, it was grabbed by the principal contractors, and then it changed the health and safety behaviour of the workforce. It wasn't so much the qualifications, it wasn't so much associations, it was the principal contractor, because of legislation, changed the workforce behaviour. And we then got installers going on different sites who actually, one site, there's no health and safety whatsoever, there's no PPE, and another construction site is actually really on the ball, there's a lot of walkways, there's a lot of signs. Now we've had new legislation drop.
Yeah.
And we've had legislation come down, which is now more about the individual's person's ability and competence. And it'll be the principal contractors for me because of the legislation. And they don't want to, obviously, basically be in legal compliance will force them to say, well, okay, now we need to look at what is competency. The challenge that the industry faces with regards to the hazards is, I think in the 80s and 90s when people were hanging upside down, wearing no PPE, we could visibly see the hazard and we say, look, we can't have them working practice, we need to change.
Yeah.
The documentation, we could basically do audits and we could say, right, there's a hazard there, we need to implement documentation. The hazard now is actually within the cards, the CVs, the certificates, because we've got people that are competent in what they do, but they might not have a license because legislation's changed. And so it's more difficult to actually identify. We've probably got a lot of principal contractors who've got safety inspectors doing safety rounds, and they're looking at the work site, looking at the equipment, writing out safety reports. But actually, you'll need a different set of skills to look at a CV and saying, actually, has that person got a license? You know, so they're the challenges that we're, you know, industry faces. And it's only through shared knowledge, things like, you know, today, that we can actually say, look, there's the rules of what we should be doing. And they've been there for a bit, they just haven't been implemented.
Joe, you seem really passionate about this, which is great to see, but I feel like for a lot of people, you know, this is kind of just like a box ticking exercise. Not everyone is actually as passionate as you are. Why are you?
That's a good question. When I was a young man, I was only about 17. I remember I was working on a oil refinery at the time. And I remember a guy saying to me that to give someone a skill or a knowledge who then go on to provide for a family was a good thing. He showed me how to do a task, and then he actually got me to show someone else. And I was like, okay, what do I do? And that stuck with me, that actually, if you're part of, if you like, giving someone a skill and a knowledge, who then actually takes that skills and knowledge and provides for a family,
sweet.
That's not a bad thing to be part of. You know, so I think there is a passion there. You know, I think anyone that's got, you know, families and kids, we're constantly taking people from the, if you like, the unknown to the known, teaching things there. And someone once wrote that service to others is the coin of life. You know, and there is morals within what we do. I think there's an empowerment. I do think there's a lot of people in the sector that don't think too much of themselves. They don't realise the skills and knowledge that they've got is right up there. They don't get the credit that they deserve. And even though for some it's a fearful thing that they've been out of further education for many years, I think certainly in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years, once we broke that barrier, I think actually constant developing of anyone's skills and knowledge is a good thing. So fingers crossed, you know, passionate. Yeah. I can't make a lasagna, I can tell you that now. You know, I'm just sort of, if you like, just one tool in the toolbox. You know, I think it's important that we empower everyone around us. I'm sort of mainly a glass half full type of guy. Now and again, I'll use humour. It's normally to deflect, you know, because I don't belong anywhere. But yeah, I just think it's a personal thing that you should do, and I enjoy it.
That's lovely. Thank you, Joe. That's really sweet.
Thank you.
So, okay, considering everything, considering your passion and everything you just said, what's one thing that you feel you would like to see change in the industry ASAP?
Can I have 10? I think Dame Judith Hackett made a really good point that the attitudes and culture needs to change. I think we need really strong leadership, that we have to be honest with ourselves, that we've gone from probably a period in our time, you know, as a small nation, we were probably dominant when it came to engineering, construction in the last century, where an audit's taken place, you know, by our own government telling us it's not good enough. And it's so bad that we've changed the law. And I think there needs to be an acceptance of that.
Yeah.
I think we need to actually take ownership of that we have failed. You know, we've got thousands upon thousands of people who have skills, they have knowledge, but actually that doesn't mean they've got a license to do what they do. No. And it's fragmented. And that's what we've seen. Certainly, you know, I've always been passionate about apprenticeships, you know, probably being a traditionalist, of that mentor, of that coach. Realistically, we've probably created a system where the actual workforce has taught themselves. They've been able to go to work quite freely. They've not really entered an engineering, if you like, pathway. And a lot of people are able to assemble components and install a system. But actually, they've missed out on, well, what does the system actually do? What is this building that I'm in? And that normally comes with if you like, more of a traditional sort of like what we'd say an apprenticeship of, it's not just about the installation and the components. There's a lot more that goes within it. And I feel like a lot of people now who we need to get licensed need to be given the opportunity to learn then, if like skills and knowledge, because they're the ones that are going to cascade that down. You know, no one person or one company or one institution is going to solve the challenges we've got. It's going to need collaborations from all of us. And certainly with the supervisors, I feel play a huge part, because they're, in essence, they're the teachers of, if you like, now. And we need to empower them, not just to check the jobs that have gone into specification and the multiple things they've got responsible for, but they're actually they're the overseers, and they're the ones that see the people under them every day. So I think there's lots of challenges. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We are seeing a change. I think what the industry faces, like I've said before, it will take collaborations.
Yeah.
Bridges will be needed to be mended. Institutions will have to start speaking to each other. But we can't get away from the fact that at the moment, apprenticeships, certainly building engineering services and a lot of construction, is probably its lowest it's ever been. And we need to ask the question, how did we get to this point? What did we fail at? Sometimes I use an analogy of, it reminds me of being on a manufacturer's institution, and we're in a manufacturing place, and we've got components coming down the conveyor belt, and actually they're defective, and we're trying to fix that component on the conveyor belt. And actually we should say, well, who's supplying these? Where are we getting these components? So why have we got people turning up with fragmented skills, fragmented knowledge, bad practices? Where is the entry level? And I think we do need to address that. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we need to have a will to do it.
I think, like you said, it's a lot to do with the acceptance that we have a lot to work on, which I feel is easier said than done. There's a lot of people in denial that, we've done it this way for years, but like you said, that's why it's a collaborative effort, and there's no better time to start than today, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, strangely enough, there's a national occupational standards to reflect on your own practices.
No way.
Yeah, it's LD10 actually. Yeah. A lot of teachers, sort of go through it, but yeah, it's funny enough, it's one of the things we've introduced in some of our programs where
there really is one for everything.
There really is one for everything. And actually, if there isn't, we can certainly have a word with the Sector Skills Council and develop it. But yeah, there's a national occupational standards for reflecting on your own practices. And we just need to collaborate. There's a lot of knowledge, if you like, that's needed to be spread out. And how we facilitate that knowledge. I think it's important that we don't look at it as though, certainly with a lot of health and safety at the beginning of the century, where it was very much put on the workforce without telling them why. It was, you will wear that hat, you will do it this way.
Okay.
Yeah, so then there's a resistance of,
exactly.
It's a behavioural thing. I'd again go back to the time when the seatbelt first come about, no one wanted to wear it. Now you won't get in a car without it because it feels like a comfort. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges for the sector. There's quite a few things I'd like to change.
There's one thing in particular I wanted to ask you about, which is about occupations having no qualifications. Why do you think that is?
The qualifications do exist for a lot of occupations. I think what we need to take ownership on then, if we take the sector skills councils, again, which is your link, sector skills councils normally are responsible for standards, national occupational standards. They're responsible for the apprenticeships, and they're responsible for the provision. So we've had qualifications that have been developed by awarding bodies over the last, say, 25 years. What's failed is the, if you like, institutions and people putting the provision in for them. If I give you an example of ventilation, currently there's no apprenticeship programs virtually in ventilation across the United Kingdom. I think in England they're about to be removed, which doesn't make sense. But that's the state of where we are. So I think we need to be honest with what's not worked. We need to be honest that we have standards, say, we've got some qualifications, but what we haven't got is the implementation plans and who does that. And there's a lot of, if you like, at certain levels, then there's a power struggle, who does what. You've got some institutions, some associations, if you like, fighting against each other. And I think sometimes they forgot that, the industry's there not to serve them, but actually maybe in position to serve the industry itself. I have a lot of faith that in the next sort of like 5 to 10 years, there'll be a change.
I hope so.
I think the new generation is coming through. Certainly the people I've met over the last few years, there's a willingness to say, well, why haven't we done this before? I think it comes to a shock to people saying, well, what do you mean the standards are there? Or, what there's no apprenticeships in ventilation. Yeah, there's not. Why is that? How did that happen? And for me, we need to learn and look at how did we get into this position? How did we get a workforce, tens of thousands of people in the workplace who weren't licensed and qualified? And if you just do a little sort of a comparison to, let's say, the petrochemical industry, the nuclear industry that we're heavily involved with, you will not walk on a petrochemical or a nuclear industry without being on, if you like, a roadmap of compliance. Their apprenticeship programs are exceptional, and we have companies who send us their training matrix for their individuals in that industry and in construction, and it's like night and day. You know, you're talking multiple qualifications, multiple certificates, and we didn't follow that path. They were challenged, I think, before the end of the year, that a lot of people had indentures from back from the 60s and 70s. Okay. No one had, if you like, an MVQ level 3 qualification, but they put in place that everyone had to have one, and everyone had to have one for an apprenticeship. So to get a card system in there, you had to be qualified. I think there was more flexibility in construction where we made a mistake of, well, you've been in the industry for years, just sign that bit of paper and you're good to go. Now we're paying for that. Yeah. Now we're realising, actually, no, you should have a licence in what you do. You know, so long question, big question.
What would you say to M&E contractors who are under the impression that the Building Safety Act does not apply to them?
Well, laws apply to everyone, and the Building Safety Act is specific, i.e., for construction and engineering, and it's not a recommendation. It's an act of law, and the fact that it's got industry competence requirements in there, it's got sections of the building regulations for inspection, it's got sections of mis-selling and giving misinformation. I mean, it's a huge document, but the Building Safety Act applies to the construction and engineering industry because it's an act of law. So any individual that thinks that act doesn't apply to them, it does apply to them.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Joe. You've been honestly a delightful guest, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners also have. So thank you. Please come back.
Christmas special.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure. Normally, people don't listen to me for more than 10 minutes unless they've had a drink, but thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who watched or listened. Don't forget to check out our other episodes, and we will see you in the next one. Bye. Hey, wow! Whoa.
Is it okay?
It was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe.